Hello, and welcome to the Modern Context Podcast. I'm your host, Yasmin Aaliyah Khan, and I'm so happy that you're here. If you're back, thanks for coming back, and if it's your first time, I'm very glad to have you. So, I got sick again last week. I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but I'm mostly better now. My fiance recently started a new job, and this one requires that he goes into the office a bit more than the last job. It was like when you send a kid to daycare for the first time and they come home with all kinds of bugs. That's what happened. So I was very annoyed. I feel like since the start of 2024, I've been sick more days than I haven't been, and it's been a real drag. I'm over it. Funny thing about the work I do, I can feel mostly fine, but if my voice is no good, then I'm no good. My voice is a significant part of this life that I have chosen. Maybe I should treat it more like a singer would, no dairy, all the throat coat, and no extraneous speech. But then if you asked anyone who knows me, they would tell you that I am full of extraneous speech. So real quick, I think I said in the last episode that this episode would be about Ireland and the potential reunification of the island, but then I realized that St. Patrick's Day is coming up in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to hold off on Ireland for the next episode, episode 15. I already started my research on it though, and I've got to say, I've never really covered the UK or Ireland before like this, and the history of it all is incredibly daunting. So many Henrys and Jameses and popes and kings. It's a lot, but I promise I will do my best to give you the most relevant and interesting highlights. But while I was researching about Ireland, I was also reading Dune. I'm going to see the movie this weekend, so by now I have read the first book and I've seen the first movie. As always, whenever I get sucked into some kind of fictional world, I can't help but draw parallels between that world and our own. And I'm not trying to say that in like a I'm not like other girls kind of way. You're supposed to draw parallels with art. That's why art is created. That's why we consume art. It's commentary. There are threads of truths within these works of art that resonate with us, some more obvious than others. So naturally, that got me thinking about storytelling. Stories always have those familiar threads and themes and motifs. They have similar story structures, they're dependent on character development, and they play with dichotomies and metaphors and archetypes. And sometimes, because there's so much science and structure to this art form, it can get predictable at times. Those Hallmark Christmas movies are the absolute case in point for predictability. Ambitious and artistically driven creators, then, have the daunting task of staying within the storytelling framework while creating something new, interesting, and thought-provoking. Of course, they need to be careful when attempting to subvert expectations just for the sake of subverting expectations because, well, we all remember the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones. With any art form, true skill and talent shows itself when one knows the rules but understands how and when to break them. Since art imitates reality, or arguably vice versa, the structures themselves are difficult to evade entirely. In essence, works of fiction are often predictable because people are predictable. Part of that predictability, I think, stems from the fact that none of us know why we're here or what we're supposed to be doing with our lives. And I know that sounds dramatic, but every saga, if given enough time and freedom to develop fully, will eventually at least approach that question. And I think that's our topic for today. No, I'm not going to figure out what the meaning of life is in this podcast episode, but I am going to explore our relationship to storytelling. Besides, as it would appear, we don't have to know what the meaning of life is to have an intimate connection to it. So one thing that did come up quite a bit for me early in my Ireland research was Celtic lore. Celtic lore, especially its pagan roots, is interesting to us as Americans because so much of what we attribute to paganism stems from it. Paganism, in simple terms, really just refers to religious practices and beliefs outside of the major monotheistic religions. And most often, people tend to use the term to refer to those beliefs which predate and often came into conflict with those monotheistic religions. Today, paganism is usually thought to refer to ancient religions or polytheistic religions, or even just lore and mythology. A lot of paganism, however, focuses on the worship or celebration or reverence, whatever you want to call it, of nature, that which you can see, that which you can feel, and that to which we are all intrinsically bound. So, despite whatever modern connotations might be associated with the word pagan these days, it's really not a bad or evil thing. It's not necessarily associated with witches or witchcraft, at least not any more so than so-called witches are associated with herbal remedies from the garden or the observation of the lunar cycles. But in the United States, I don't need to tell you that a lot of our ancestors here came from Europe, and a lot of us can trace our roots back to England, Ireland, and Scotland. And by the way, I'm saying us because I'm an American, but my personal roots obviously aren't European unless you want to get into British colonialism, and that feels like another story for another day. Anyway, because of these strong cultural roots, it makes sense that a lot of our modern traditions stem from pagan, specifically Celtic roots. The most obvious of these is probably Halloween, for example. And there's a trend happening in the United States. Currently, more Americans identify as not being religiously affiliated than ever before. And with that, there seems to be a movement back to more pagan-based belief systems and lifestyles. Perhaps it's disillusionment with organized religion, or it could be a disdain for our over-governed, overworked, over-technologized world. But whatever the reason, people are seeking connection with their own existence and their place within the world. And where better to find place than within the earth itself? Millennials in particular are leading the charge when it comes to doing things with our hands again. We're rediscovering the trades and skills and art forms that the modern world has deemed obsolete at worst and not profitable at best. And in a modern world that keeps telling us to produce more and produce it faster, people are rebelling in the most peaceful way imaginable by simply moving more slowly through life, enjoying the moments that are there, and doing what they can to exist on their own terms while simultaneously functioning within society. And honestly, just doing that much is a lot easier said than done. I try to do this. I kind of always have. If you follow me on social media, you may have noticed that I don't really post very often. I think the last thing on my IG feed is a selfie that I took on my last birthday, which was 4 months ago in October. For a somewhat public figure, I should probably spend more time on social media than I do, but I just can't do it. When I'm working, I'm on the computer, I'm engaged with the zeitgeist, I'm doing all of the media things. But when I'm not working, my phone is often in another room. I'm cooking, I'm baking, I'm decorating my home, refinishing a piece of furniture, spending time with my friends and family. I'm writing, but not necessarily a video script. I'm probably journaling by hand. I'm listening to music, not just having it on in the background, but I'm sitting and listening to music. And I do yoga. Right now I'm planning my own wedding, which is a whole thing on its own. And I get that all of that is a privilege. My life is, in a lot of ways, atypical from the way that most of you probably live. I think we can all say that to a certain extent, but my point is, when I'm not required to be engaging with technology, I am doing so as little as possible. I'm doing things with my hands, and I'm literally physically moving slowly as I'm doing them. We need to connect with this world around us, and technology, despite its promises to foster unprecedented connection around the globe, has felt alienating and distracting. So with all of this, I guess I'm not surprised that the connection to nature and to others, and the ritualism and deference of pagan traditions has been appealing to people lately. It makes sense that escapism and nostalgia are also commodities right now. I can't speak for Gen Z, but millennials really seem to be yearning for a simpler time, a time before social media, a time before smartphones were glued to our hands, a time when the present moment was ours. It wasn't being siphoned away by notifications and the feeling that we should be being productive with every minute of our lives, monetizing our every talent, skill, or interest, side hustling our ways into oblivion. And maybe, at the end of it all, we'll be able to buy a house, or start a family, or retire, or pay off our student loans, or just take a vacation. maybe then we'll be able to have that which our parents and grandparents had. We are tired, and we're almost desperate to find meaning in a world that is looking more and more dystopic. Now, with the looming threat of AI, whatever that's even going to look like, people are becoming even more disillusioned as far as putting in more effort and getting less back in return. But speaking of AI, Dune deals with AI quite a bit in a way that makes this particular fictional universe even more relevant to today's world than most. Don't worry, I won't spoil anything if you haven't seen the movies or read the books. Whenever you have a world-building fictional story, there are fantastical elements to it, but the reality of those fictional worlds is really what draws us to them. Technically, though, I have to say, Dune isn't fantasy, it's science fiction. The first book came out in 1965, and reading it now, nearly 60 years later, I've got to say, it's quite prophetic. And yeah, it's possible that you can say that about any sci-fi story, because as I said, the real-life elements of those stories will always be relatable in some sense. The politics, the human relationships, the societal structures, etc. So for those of you who don't know, Dune is set far into the future on distant planets. Earth is barely mentioned. Its existence has been all but forgotten, only preserved in the inherited memories of a very select few. Usually, I don't like futuristic stuff. Like Blade Runner wasn't for me. I also usually don't care too much about space stuff. I never really got into Star Wars, and I've tried. I've never seen Star Trek, and I barely tolerated those Disney Channel Xenon movies when I was a kid. I just hate like the cold, silvery, futuristic aesthetic. It's like the least cozy and comforting thing I can think of. Those space stations and spaceships that future people always seem to live on make me feel claustrophobic. Half the time, people are just floating around some dark, vast void of space. And I know they're on different planets in Star Wars, but for a good chunk of the time, they're just in space. There's this constant feeling of isolation, like in Interstellar. I did actually like Interstellar, but the idea of anyone being alone on a distant planet for years at a time gives me a tummy ache, especially when that person is Matt Damon. My preferred fictional worlds are more old world, like Lord of the Rings old, Game of Thrones old, no technology old, no threat of AI or robots old. But with Dune, it's set so far into the future that the real life future we're looking at now has already come and gone. They're very much settled on these new planets, so it doesn't give me all of those horrible space feelings. The AI revolution has already happened, the robots already took over, and ultimately, it was such a problem that the humans ended up having to ban robots and AI altogether. Humanity was finally, after all of that, deemed to be too valuable a thing to waste or even jeopardize. In the Duniverse, AI started out very much as it's starting out now. It was built as a thing that could help ease some of the mental load for humans. It would take care of mindless tasks so that we could focus our big brains on other big brain tasks. But eventually, more and more thinking and creativity got outsourced to the AI. Eventually, the AI became incredibly complex and powerful, while the humans all but forgot how to think for themselves. They led dull and uninspired lives, and then, inevitably, the robots took over. So here's the quote from the book. Quote, "Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them." The quote notably doesn't say that the thinking machines enslaved men. It said that other men enslaved them. If AI takes over and we allow ourselves to be destroyed by it, we would have done it to ourselves. And being destroyed by something doesn't have to be something as dramatic as literal enslavement or even terminators or sentinels that are sent here to genocide humanity for being too inefficient. It can be much more subtle, like fostering dependency on technology or losing one's identity to something more artificial. And isn't that already happening? Wasn't it already happening even before AI became a real tangible thing? Social media has warped the ways we see ourselves and others. It's changed the way we interact with one another, with our government, and with our entertainers. Photoshop has had us questioning reality for decades. Autocorrect tells us that we don't even need to learn how words are spelled anymore. Audiobooks tell us, yes, we can do the dishes while reading a book because reading isn't valuable on its own. We've got to multitask whenever possible to optimize our productivity. We can't even waste the hours that we're asleep. We've got to use that time to take in some binaural beats and reprogram our waking minds with subliminal affirmations. We need to manifest our dream lives while we dream. Was it always like this, or is it new? Frank Herbert envisioned this world 60 years ago when he wrote Dune, even though technology wasn't nearly as far along back then as it is today. Is it possible that humanity and human nature are so predictable that we can really only follow one or maybe a few general trajectories? Okay, I feel predictable now because, of course, everything is going to come back to capitalism. Capitalism thrives on dependency, and it doesn't really matter what people are dependent on as long as they're dependent on something. And the reality is that humans are dependent on a lot of things all the time. For example, we have our basic physical needs, water, air, food, etc. We have our emotional needs, love, belonging, security, community. And we have societal needs like infrastructure, access to resources, transportation, etc. Of course, there are more things, but all of those dependencies can and will inevitably be monetized in a capitalistic society. And not to be grim, but even with other societal structures like maybe socialism or communism, capital is still the underlying driver of all things. Supply and demand and access will always govern the people in one way or another. It all stems from the understanding that if you don't control the resources, then someone else will. Or going back to the Dune quote, other men with machines can and will enslave us if we appear unenslaved, if we appear free. A more palatable example is maybe an open field. A field is a thing of value on its own. If you leave it be, it's a home for wildlife, it's a space for gathering, it can be a floodplain, and it's beautiful. Green spaces are proven to be good for our mental health too. But if you leave it be, you run the risk of someone else seeing it as an opportunity. To that other person, that empty space is a space where they can put something like a Starbucks or a gas station or a parking lot. It's an empty space that they can monetize and profit off of. They don't see the inherent value in the field itself, they just see the capitalistic opportunity that it offers to themselves. And it just takes one opportunistic person with enough money or power or influence to ruin things for everyone, even under the guise of creating value. But really, would you rather have a pretty, multi-use, carbon-positive field or another parasitic, paved-over piece of land with another Starbucks sitting on top of it? The argument that these types always give you is job creation, but that's another story. And the more you have, the easier it is to desire and acquire more. You don't have to think about each new acquisition as much as the previous one. It just becomes second nature to take and develop and exploit however you justify or frame it. So I'll wrap this up with Marvel. Marvel is part space, part Earth. I think an argument could be made that the Marvel Universe is more sci-fi than it is fantasy, even though people smarter than me, I'm sure, could argue the scientific plausibility of some of the plot lines. But let's think about the way the Marvel film franchise has played out over the past 15 years or so. It started off strong with Iron Man, then we got Captain America, Thor, etc., until we finally got our first Avengers film. That first film ballooned into more characters, more origin films, more Avengers films, and with each one, the enemy or the threat had to become bigger, badder, and more formidable than the last. It culminated with Thanos, an alien from another planet who could and did destroy half of life here on Earth with a snap of his fingers. To reverse it, the Avengers had to time travel, they had to go quantum, they had to fight aliens on distant planets, and absorb the power of a star and sacrifice Scarlett Johansson. But they did it all because the stakes could not have been any higher. They did it for humanity, for the survival of the human race, for the preservation of this reality. And all of our struggles, whether in art or life, come back to this tenet. Everything can be and is justified by these incredibly high stakes and by the incredibly high cost that humanity would have to pay if our heroes didn't do all the things. The Marvel Cinematic Universe as a business entity also sort of speaks to this sort of survivalism, because if you ask me, it should have stopped at the end of Endgame. But since Disney is running a business that is more concerned with profit than artistry, the allure and ability to suck an entity dry before finally admitting defeat was simply too great. Instead of going out on a high note, they kept churning out movies and TV shows until they became unprofitable and uninteresting. The quality of each dwindled as they put increasing output demands on themselves while the audience became less invested. How do you top a villain like Thanos? How do you get bigger and more expansive, ironically, than the quantum realm? Even Michelle Pfeiffer can only do so much. Also, you get rid of Chris Evans and you leave me with Chris Pratt. That's not fun for me anymore. So anyway, the question shouldn't be, how do we top this, but rather, what's really important here? Is humanity really just human bodies? Yes, but it's also much more than that. Humanity is the beauty of everyday life, and unfortunately, that's constantly being stolen from us. The fight for our individual humanity isn't as exciting or dynamic as having to fight a genocidal, narcissistic alien. On the contrary, it's a long-haul struggle. It's about endurance and strength, and that strength can take on so many different forms. Earlier in this episode, I told you that I tend to gravitate more towards old-world fictional landscapes, so I'll leave you with a quote from Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings. The stakes were very high in that saga too, about as high as Tolkien could have dreamed them to be. The ring threatened the fate of man. The ring and the evil behind it threatened all that was good in Middle-earth. As Sam and Frodo faced overwhelming odds and adversity to prevent the worst from happening, even Frodo needed reminders as to what it was all for. And there was Sam, the hero of the Lord of the Rings saga, a hobbit who never forgot how precious those small moments are. He told Frodo, quote, "It's like the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad has happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. I know now folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." Well, I can't top that, so I will leave it there. That's a wrap for this episode of the Modern Context Podcast. I hope you all had a lovely leap day, by the way, and until next time, we would love to hear from you. Please reach out to the show at hello@modconpod.com with any suggestions or questions you might have for us. Also, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on YouTube and tell your friends about us. And of course, thank you all for listening. I can't wait to see you next time. Cheers.